When I first moved into this neighborhood nearly a decade ago, I thought I knew what to expect from the Homeowners Association. They were supposed to keep things orderly, maintain the common spaces, and handle disputes when they came up. In reality, the HOA always felt more like a nosy neighbor with a clipboard than a helpful organization. They loved rules, fines, and power more than they loved community. But for the most part, I stayed under the radar. I paid my dues, kept my house looking decent, and minded my own business. That all changed the day. Clover and Biscuit came into my life. It was a Saturday morning when I drove out to a family farm just outside town. I had no intention of coming home with goats that day. I was actually there to buy some firewood for our backyard fire pit. But then I saw them, two little goats, barely knee-high, curious and playful. One of them nibbled at my shoelace, while the other tried to climb onto a hay bale. I laughed harder than I had in weeks. The farmer noticed and said they'd make good backyard goats. Gentle, easy to take care of, and believe it or not, they'll mow your lawn for you. I thought he was joking. But after a quick conversation and some unexpected encouragement from my daughter, who had come with me, I was loading Clover and Biscuit into the back of my truck. When I pulled into the driveway, my wife gave me a look that could only be described as equal parts shock and disbelief. "You went out for firewood and came back with goats?" she asked, crossing her arms. "Best lawnmowers we'll ever own." I grinned. My daughter squealed with excitement. She ran to the truck, hugged both goats, and immediately claimed Clover as her new best friend. Within minutes, she had tied a pink ribbon around Clover's neck and was parading her around the yard like a prized pony. Surprisingly, the goats settled in easily. They were quiet, friendly, and absolutely relentless when it came to grass and weeds. Within a week, my lawn looked better than it ever had with any mower. Clover and Biscuit ate everything evenly, and they didn't leave behind the patchy mess I usually had after mowing. Even better, they chewed down weeds I'd struggled with for years, including a nasty poison ivy patch I'd never been able to handle myself. Soon enough, the neighbors started noticing. Kids would point and giggle as they passed by, calling out, "Hi, Clover." "Hi, Biscuit." People walking their dogs stopped at my fence just to watch them graze. One neighbor even asked if I'd be willing to lend them out for a day to take care of his own overgrown backyard. My daughter loved showing them off, and even my wife, who had been skeptical at first, admitted that they were easier to take care of than she expected. Everything seemed perfect, until the HOA decided it WASN. Single quotes, the first letter arrived in the mail about a month later. I knew right away it was from the HOA because of the stiff, formal language and the bolded heading that read, "Notice of violation, according to them." I was in breach of community guidelines that prohibited livestock from being kept on residential property. They didn't bother to distinguish between cows, chickens, or two small goats. They lumped Clover and Biscuit into the same category as if I were running a full-blown farm out of my backyard. The letter demanded that I remove the goats immediately or face fines of $200 per week. I laughed when I read it, thinking it had to be a mistake. My goats weren't noisy. They weren't dangerous. They weren't causing problems for anyone. If anything, they were making the neighborhood a little brighter and my yard a whole lot cleaner. I tossed the letter aside, thinking common sense would prevail. But then came the second letter, this one with a photo attached. Someone had leaned over my fence and taken a picture of Clover munching happily on a patch of grass. It felt invasive, like the HOA was spying on me. They doubled down in this letter, threatening increased fines and even legal action if I didn't remove the livestock. That was the moment I realized they weren't going to back off. This wasn't just about two goats anymore. It was about the HOA trying to control every little detail of my life. And I wasn't about to let them win, so I did what anyone in my position would do. I talked to my neighbors. I went door to door, asking if Clover and Biscuit bothered them. To my surprise, Every single person I asked said no. Most of them actually said they liked the goats. A couple of families even admitted their kids specifically asked to walk past my house just to see them. One neighbor down the block even asked if I'd let the goats graze in his yard because he hated mowing. That's when it hit me. Clover and Biscuit weren't just my goats anymore. They were becoming neighborhood mascots. The next HOA meeting was coming up, and I knew exactly what I had to do. I wasn't going to hide. If the HOA wanted to confront me, they were going to have to do it face to face with the whole community watching. Walking into that HOA meeting felt like stepping into enemy territory. I wasn't usually the type to attend these things, but that night I showed up early and sat right in the front row. Clover and Biscuit weren't just goats anymore. They were the reason I was suddenly standing up to a group I'd mostly ignored for years. The board sat up front at a long folding table, looking smug as ever. The president, a woman named Linda, who had a reputation for treating the HOA like her personal kingdom, shuffled papers dramatically before the meeting even started. She kept glancing in my direction. "With that, we've got you cornered. Look." When the floor opened up for complaints and community issues, Linda wasted no time. She cleared her throat and said, "We need to address a violation that has been ignored. One of our homeowners has chosen to keep livestock on his property in direct violation of our bylaws. This is a serious matter." Every head in the room turned toward me. I stood up slowly, making sure I wasn't rattled. "If you're talking about Clover and Biscuit, my goats, then let's talk about it, because I think we need some perspective here." A murmur went through the crowd. Some of the kids from the neighborhood giggled at the names, and I caught a few adults smirking. Linda shot me a glare. "There is no perspective needed. The rules are clear. No livestock. Period." I held up my hands. Livestock. These aren't cows or pigs or chickens running wild. They're two small goats. Quiet, friendly, cleaner than some people's dogs, if we're being honest. And if we want to talk about community impact, let's talk about the fact that Clover and Biscuit have done more for this neighborhood than the HOA has. That stirred the room. A couple of people clapped, others nodded. Linda looked like she'd swallowed a lemon. "The rules are the rules. You signed them when you moved here, and rules can change," I said calmly, "especially if the community decides they should." Isn't that what this is supposed to be about, community? I had prepared for this moment. Over the past week, I'd gathered signatures from neighbors who supported keeping the goats. Nearly everyone I asked had signed, even people I barely knew. I pulled the papers from my folder and handed them to the board. "These," I said, "are from the people who actually live here, the people you claim to represent. And they're saying loud and clear that Clover and Biscuit aren't a problem." Linda snatched the papers like they offended her just by existing. She didn't even glance at them before shoving them aside. "This is irrelevant. Our bylaws state," but before she could finish, an older neighbor stood up in the back. Mr. Harrison, a retired teacher who rarely spoke at meetings, raised his voice. "I say, let the man keep his goats. They keep his yard neat. They don't bother anybody, and my grandkids love them. What's the harm?" Another voice chimed in. Then another. Soon half the room was speaking up, defending Clover and Biscuit. Some said they enjoyed seeing them. Others mentioned how much cleaner my lawn looked. And one mom even pointed out that her child had gotten over a fear of animals by visiting my goats. Linda tried to regain control, banging her little wooden gavel, but the energy in the room had shifted. For once, people weren't backing down. They were standing up, not just for me, but against the pettiness of the HOA. I looked at Linda, who is now visibly flustered. "You can keep calling them livestock, but to this community, they're more than that. They're a part of the neighborhood." The meeting ended in chaos, with Linda declaring she would review the matter further while clearly fuming at being challenged. But I walked out with my head high. I hadn't solved the problem yet, but I had shown the HOA that I wasn't going to roll over. And more importantly, I'd learned something that night the neighborhood was on my side. What happened next, though, was when things really started to escalate. Linda wasn't about to let go of this fight, and she had tricks up her sleeve I didn't see coming. I thought the meeting had settled things, or at least bought me time. But I should have known better. Linda wasn't the type to let something go. If anything, she doubled down when she felt challenged. A week later, I came home from work to find a bright orange notice taped to my front door. My stomach sank before I even read it. Sure enough, was a violation notice. According to the HOA, I was being fined $100 a day until I removed unauthorized livestock from my property. $100 a day. I just stood there on my porch, holding that piece of paper while Clover and Biscuit munched happily on the grass like nothing was wrong. I couldn't help but laugh bitterly. You two are apparently worth $100 each every single day. That night, I sat at my kitchen table and ran the numbers. At that rate, I'd be buried in fines within weeks. Linda knew exactly what she was doing. She was trying to bleed me dry until I gave up. But here's the thing. I don't like being bullied. And when someone tries to back me into a corner, I come out swinging. The next morning, I decided to make this fight public. I filmed a short video of Clover and Biscuit in the yard, showing how peaceful and harmless they were. Then I explained the situation, how the HOA was fining me $100 a day because of 2 goats that weren't bothering anyone. I uploaded it to a local community Facebook group, and within hours, the comments started rolling in. People were outraged. Seriously. The HOA is wasting time and money on this. Those goats are adorable. Leave them alone. I'd rather have goats next door than Linda's loud pool parties. The post got shared, and by the next day, dozens of neighbors had shown up at my house to see Clover and Biscuit for themselves. Kids fed them carrots, parents took pictures, and even a few folks who had never spoken to me before suddenly became allies. But Linda wasn't done. The following week, she brought in animal control. I came home from the grocery store to see a county animal control officer parked in front of my house. My heart dropped high, thought they were there to take Clover and Biscuit away. But when I walked up, the officer shook his head and said, "Look, I don't know what your HOA's problem is, but your goats aren't violating any county ordinances. They're healthy, the yard's clean, and they're properly contained. You're good." The relief I felt in that moment was overwhelming. I asked the officer if he could put that in writing. He did. And that piece of paper became my shield. At the next HOA meeting, I walked in with a copy of the letter and slapped it down on the table in front of Linda. According to the county, my goats are perfectly legal. So unless the HOA plans on rewriting the law, suggest you stop wasting everyone's time. The room erupted with applause. Neighbors were grinning, whispering, and even a few board members looked like they were secretly rooting for me. Linda's face turned red, but she forced a tight smile. Well, if the county has no issue, then we'll have to review our bylaws. That was her way of saying the fight wasn't over. And I knew it. But the more she pushed, the more support I gained. Clover and Biscuit weren't just my goats anymore. They had become the neighborhood's goats. And then came the twist I didn't expect. One of the neighbors who worked for the city's parks department had seen my video online. He showed up at my house with a surprising proposition. What if we did a little demonstration at the community park? You bring your goats, let them graze for a day. People can see firsthand how effective they are at clearing grass and weeds. It'd be fun for the kids, and it'd prove a point. I couldn't say yes fast enough. That weekend, Clover and Biscuit had their first public job. Families gathered at the park. Kids followed them around, and by the end of the day, the goats had cleared a huge section of overgrown grass. People were laughing, taking videos and saying things like, "Why don't we just rent goats instead of paying landscapers?" It was a huge success. But what I didn't realize at the time was that this event would be the turning point. Not just for my battle with the HOA, but for the entire neighborhood, because suddenly, Clover and Biscuit weren't just my defense, they were heroes. The park demonstration had been such a success that word spread fast. People in the neighborhood were actually excited to see Clover and Biscuit working. Some even joked about starting a goat club for kids to visit and help feed them. For once, there was energy in the community, positive energy, and I could tell that annoyed Linda more than anything. See? The HOA had always operated on fear. They handed out fines, threats, and notices like candy, and people obeyed because they didn't want the hassle. But my goats had flipped the script. Suddenly, people saw that the HOA's rules weren't absolute. And that scared Linda so. She came up with a new tactic. 2 weeks after the park event, I got another notice. This time, the HOA claimed that Clover and Biscuit were creating a public nuisance. According to Linda, their constant bleating was disrupting the peace and quiet of the neighborhood. The irony was hilarious because anyone who had actually been near my goats knew they were incredibly quiet. They only made little sounds when they wanted food or attention. And it was nothing compared to barking dogs or the lawnmowers that roared every Saturday. It was obvious. Linda was just grasping at straws. But instead of getting angry, I decided to get clever. I bought a small security camera and set it up in the backyard to capture audio and video. For the next week, I let it run, recording Clover and Biscuit during the day. When I reviewed the footage, I laughed out loud. 90% of the time, they were either silently chewing grass or lounging in the sun. The constant bleating Linda was so upset about. It added up to maybe 30 seconds in a whole week. I compiled the footage into a short video with a tongue-in-cheek title, "The Noisy Menace of Clover and Biscuit." I posted it in the same neighborhood Facebook group. Within hours, people were sharing it and mocking the HOA's claims. One guy even commented, "My neighbor's leaf blower is louder than these goats. Can we fine him instead?" The momentum was clearly shifting. But Linda wasn't finished. At the next board meeting, she tried a different angle, claiming the goats posed a health hazard. What if children get sick from being near them? She said dramatically, waving a stack of papers like she had evidence. That's when another neighbor, Susan, who happened to be a veterinarian, spoke up. Actually, goats are no more dangerous than dogs or cats. And in some cases, they're cleaner. If you're worried about diseases, you should be more concerned about the raccoons that dig in everyone's trash cans. The room laughed. And Linda's stack of papers suddenly looked ridiculous. By this point, I wasn't just defending Clover and Biscuit, was exposing the HOA's nonsense for what it really was. And the more they pushed, the more united the neighborhood became. And then came the twist that no one saw coming. The city council reached out. Apparently, the Parks Department had been so impressed with the goat demonstration at the park that they were considering a pilot program. They wanted Clover and Biscuit to help clear brush in public spaces, which could reduce the need for pesticides and noisy equipment. When I told the neighborhood about it, people were ecstatic. Suddenly, my illegal livestock were being recognized by the city as a valuable resource, Linda. She was furious. She slammed her notebook shut at the next HOA meeting and said, "This is getting out of hand. We cannot have livestock representing our community." But the crowd wasn't with her anymore. One neighbor stood up and said, "Actually, Linda, I think it's great. The goats bring us together. For once, people are smiling instead of arguing. Isn't that what a community is supposed to be?" The applause that followed drowned out whatever Linda was going to say next. I walked home that night with Clover and Biscuit trailing behind me, both of them happily chewing on grass. And for the first time, I realized this wasn't just about fighting the HOA anymore. It was about proving that sometimes the things we're told are, against the rules are exactly the things a community needs. But Linda wasn't done yet. In fact, she was about to launch her most underhanded move yet one. That could have taken the goats away for good if it hadn't backfired spectacularly. Linda's frustration had reached its peak. The goats had gone from being illegal livestock to local celebrities, and the city was even considering them for a pilot program. She couldn't stand it. So she launched her final, most desperate attack. One morning, I opened my mailbox and found an official-looking envelope stamped with red ink. Violation Escalation Notice, according to the letter. The HOA board had voted to fine me $500 a week until I removed the livestock from my property. And if I refused, they would seek a court injunction. Linda thought she had me cornered. But what she didn't count on was the fact that I had been quietly documenting everything, every notice, every meeting, every false claim. And I wasn't the only one. When word of the fine spread, my neighbors rallied. Several of them sent letters of support, pointing out how Clover and Biscuit had improved the neighborhood by reducing overgrown weeds and saving people from paying for expensive landscapers. Susan, the veterinarian, even wrote a professional statement verifying that the goats posed no health risk whatsoever. But the real nail in Linda's coffin came from the city itself. The Parks Department sent me an official letter congratulating me for innovative community environmental efforts and formally inviting Clover and Biscuit into their brush clearing program. Not only were the goats not illegal, but now they were literally city-approved lawn care. I printed out the letter and brought it to the next HOA meeting. When it was my turn to speak, I stood, cleared my throat, and handed the board copies of the letter. So, let me get this straight, I said, holding up Linda's violation notice in one hand and the city's letter in the other. According to you, my goats are illegal. According to the city, they're environmental heroes. Who do you think people are going to believe? The room erupted in laughter and applause. Linda's face turned red, and for the first time, she didn't have a comeback. The fines were dropped immediately. In fact, the rest of the board voted to officially amend the HOA rules to allow small livestock for community use under certain conditions, of course. But that didn't bother me. Clover and Biscuit were safe, and the neighborhood had spoken loud and clear. And here's the best part. Not long after, the city actually featured Clover and Biscuit in a local news segment about eco-friendly lawn care. Suddenly, the whole town knew about them. Kids started calling them the Goat Heroes, and families would stroll by my yard just to say hi. As for Linda, she eventually resigned from the HOA board. I think she realized she had lost the war, and the community was tired of her constant battles. So, in the end, two little goats did what no one else had been able to do. They united a neighborhood, took down an overbearing HOA president, and proved that sometimes the simplest solutions are the best. And me. I just smile every time I look out my window and see Clover and Biscuit happily munching away. They weren't just lawn care heroes anymore. They were a symbol of standing up for what's right. So, what do you think? Should goats be allowed in every neighborhood, or was Linda right to try and ban them? If you've ever dealt with a power-hungry HOA, drop your story in the comments below. Love to hear it. And if you enjoyed this tale of two goats taking on the system, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more crazy HOA stories. Until next time, remember sometimes the underdog, or in this case, the undergoat, wins.